All right, so we have a single item on our agenda this afternoon, and that is the, let's see, there's an order number on this. You know, somehow it feels far less formal when we're sitting here in this room, but exactly the same number of people are watching as we were watching this morning.
Theory.
So, we have a work session on the rules of conduct, is what it's called, and the administrator, Steve and Dinah, provided us with a sample, a draft document. Much of it is based on Douglas County, Nevada, which pretty good deliberative body last time I checked. Is that the same as this? So, how shall we start?
I'd be happy to kick it off.
That'd be great.
This is really, I would just say, Mr. Chair and Commissioners, an introductory discussion, not asking or expecting that you would take action today, but we wanted to bring this to sort of begin the discussion. So I'll make a few, I'm not going to walk through the document. Hopefully you've had a chance to review it. If you haven't, hopefully you can take some time over the next few days and weeks to do that. But I want to just make some comments about sort of what the impetus was, why we're even considering looking at this, where some of the language came from, what the purpose and intent of this really is. And I'd start by saying, as with emergency planning, the worst time to address issues of chaos and disorder is in the midst of chaos and disorder. And the best time to plan and prepare for potential issues at some point in the future is when things are calm and working really well. So as a starting point, I will in my prior experience working in another county in another state, we dealt with some of these issues and did some of this work to establish board and staff and public expectations and policies at a time where there was more chaos and disorder, and it was much more difficult to work through that. Thankfully, we have, I will say, a high-functioning board of commissioners. All five of you have extreme, outstanding experience that you bring to the table. You all work together really effectively. I'd like to think that our staff supports the work that the board requests, and that we have really a high-functioning organization here. So we have, though, in the last few years had some incidences where we've had, challenging and contentious issues, public hearings about that have caused concern, and where there are differences of opinions from members of the community that come together and voice their opinions, where passions are highly charged. And so we want to make sure that when those incidences, and I call it, one of them was we had a work session or a public hearing, I should say, in Oak Ridge. So when we get into those situations where, emotions can be high and tensions are high, and you have people who have, a strong stake in whatever outcome and decision the Board of Commissioners may make, it can create issues. And so the goal of having some, we're calling them, for this case, rules of conduct, and all of this, again, it's all a draft. These are the boards. Ultimately, if you approve whatever version of this you approve, they're going to be your rules of conduct. So it's ultimately for you to say what you think is appropriate and not appropriate. But what we've attempted to do here was look at the lane charter, look at lane manual, existing lane manual, and what is already in place as it relates to policies for how the board operates and manages meetings and governs itself and its business. And then look at what other governments do. We looked at Douglas County, Nevada, because I had particular experience there, and we spent a lot of time working through language that we felt was appropriate and really setting expectations not only for the board, the elected Board of Commissioners, but also for staff and also for the public, that everyone who comes to a public meeting has a role in making sure that it's a respectful environment where voices can be heard in a fair and equitable manner. We also looked at the City of Eugene and City of Springfield and what they have in terms of their norms and procedures and rules of conduct. So all of that is reflected in here. I think there's opportunity for us to continue to work on this and massage and adjust some language. And so this is intended to be a starting point for that. I don't know if Diana, if you had anything else. Again, I don't, so as you walk through the document, it refers to other documents, refers to the charter. It really says the Lane Charter is what takes precedent over anything. So whatever we define in here has to work with the charter. It talks about, the boards, sort of the role of the board, and individual commissioner roles, the role of the chair and the vice chair. It talks about if issues of conflict or conflicts of interest come about, how we resolve those and kind of what steps we would take to do that. It talks about the role of the county administrator, the role of county staff, and all of our responsibilities there. So then I would just say, we talked a little bit, and Mr. Chair, you suggested that this be something that come back, whatever the board adopts, that it come back for regular review, and not unlike we do for emergency meetings and emergency preparedness issues, to come annually and just review it, and maybe some things will need to get changed or added or deleted, but at the very least that there's an understanding that these are sort of the areas that we all agree to. So I'll stop there, and then I don't know if Diana Jones, as you all I'm sure know, did the bulk of the work to pull all of this together, to sift through the various governmental documents and try to pull out the pieces that we thought were most appropriate for our organization and our board. County Council and Steve Dingle, County Council staff have reviewed this, and so I welcome their comments as well.
And you did accept my suggestion to model this on the British House of Commons, right?
I did.
It'll be loud and exciting in here, won't it?
I think not.
Would the honourable backbencher please show up?
Steve covered most of it really well. We tried to consider the role of all the parties involved in a board meeting. One of the last sentences does say that this will be a routine item that we bring back at the beginning of the year, such as board, when you bring your board assignments back and your committee assignments, things like that. The goal is to just kind of have it reviewed at once a year at least. It obviously can be reviewed at any time if we feel the need to update it. We tried to leave it brief. We didn't want to get into the full details of Robert's rules. As a matter of fact, we kind of even stated there that we're trying not to be obscure. That we want the rules to be clear and concise, and they're, so hopefully everyone can kind of follow them. And then Steve Dingle made sure we weren't kind of stating any rules that would be a violation of anything. So,
yeah, for example, the last one under 6D talks about removing persons. That's always a very sensitive potential legal issue, and that's why we put in there that the chair will consult with county council before doing that.
And the other mechanism that we have in that situation is just to retire or recess.
Which is E.
right, which is So I think the purpose of this meeting was to give you all a chance to review the document and see if you had any opinions on things that you would like to see added that are not added, if we haven't addressed something that you feel is missing, or if there's something in there that you feel might be too restrictive. We can have that discussion. I believe following this, the document will go to Policies and Procedures on September 8th for a review to make sure that it has been reviewed in addition to Steve Dingle reviewing it. We had some department directors review it, so it has had staff review and legal review.
And a part of the timing of having it today was because we did have a policy and procedure meeting scheduled for September 8th, so we brought us in ahead of the policy and procedure meeting.
One other comment, Mr. Chair, just to reflect on. I think we've thought for several years, boy, it would make sense to have these policies and procedures in place, but there was no real impetus or driving factor to really push us to do that, until the meeting that we had in Oak Ridge. And I think it occurred to us that the structure that we have, as many counties do, every year we seem to rotate chairs, and another commissioner will take on the role of the chair. And what that creates is you have this variation. Every year there's a change in style, and every individual has their strengths and weaknesses and approach and way in which they manage the meeting. And we noticed that, in that incident in Oak Ridge, that everyone, that the chair at the time, the board, staff, the public, all would have really been aided by having some tools, some sort of standard tools that we had agreed to previously about how we were going to handle those situations. And we simply had not really had that discussion or prepared for, a situation like that where you sort of get, almost a protest kind of situation about how to handle it. And so I think our feeling here is that if we have some tools, some standard tools that are made available, that regardless of who the chair and vice chair are every year, we can have confidence in how we deal with our regular meetings and when things can escalate. We have a clear process that's really objective, and that the board as a whole has supported. How we're gonna deal with that.
Gary.
So, help me understand. Currently, the Board of Commissioners do not have a document like this in place.
They do not. When I started doing some research, which was before I kind of was in this role, we used to have something called Good Governance, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's what it was called, and that was repealed. That was taken, that was reversed under the previous county administrator, and nothing was put in its place. So this is an attempt to do exactly that. And again, looking at other agencies and entities, most of them do have them in place. It wasn't hard to find anyone we looked at had some sort of rules of conduct and decorum. So I think it was just an oversight that we never really replaced what we repealed. So,
There was a move to put in a bad governance document. There we go.
Well, thank you for a little follow-up. Thank you for that. Time has come that something like this be implemented, that's for sure. There is turnover on a body like this. New people come in, they don't know how the stage is set, how their protocols and procedures, having an outline of how to conduct yourself, and individuals that appear before you it's critical, and I'm really glad that this has come to light, that we're deficient in that, and I'm glad we have a chance to amend that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, as one of the people involved in the Good Governance Board, I would say this is a good idea to have a set of rules. I think that this is a great start. I think I have a lot of questions about it that I'll try to ask quickly here. The first is that there's reference to the Lane County Charter, and there's reference to the Open Meetings Law. And as I have done a little research on this, the Open Meetings Law provides, that governments that are subject to it, a lot of state agencies, counties, cities, it talks about, the notice for the meetings and the different types of meetings. But the Lane County Charter also has additional meeting notice requirements that are above what the thing requires. And if we're going to take the time to talk about the notice requirements, if that's something that's important, because if the county administrator or the county council get thrown into the job rather quickly. And again, this is a planning document so that people kind of know what their role is. I would probably want to dig down into, and the part of the notice requirement that I'm most concerned about that I don't see here is that all the commissioners will be notified if there's a meeting. That's not a requirement under the Oregon Public Meetings Law. The public has to be notified of a board meeting, but the commissioners don't have to be noticed. But the charter, Lane County Charter, predates the open meetings law, and it says all the commissioners will be notified. And that has come up before, where some commissioners were notified of a meeting and others weren't. And in my view, that's a violation of our charter. And I'm not pointing any fingers at anyone today about that, because that wouldn't serve any good public purpose. But what I do think would be serving a public purpose is for the public, the board members, the staff, the lawyers, everybody know that that's something that is important, at least to me, that all the commissioners be notified of the meeting. And that, to me, is a protection for the public, that all the commissioners will be notified. So I don't know if that's in there.
That is not in there.
Yeah.
And I guess I would defer to the board.
Yeah.
Because while it's not in there,
It's in the charter.
it is in the charter, and this is actually a document, as I wrote it, to be a process for what do we do during a meeting.
During a meeting, okay.
Yes.
Well, that's good, and maybe that is a way to deal with some of the issues that I see in this document. If we're going to focus on, the meeting's been called, we're having the meeting, and now what's the public's role? What's the board's role? What's the staff role?
Right.
Okay, I get that, and I think that's a really good way of making it clear what we're really trying to do here. And that is, if we're trying to acquaint the public, the board, and the staff with what do we do and what's a good, usual way for us to run, and nobody's really being out of order. But it also guides us when there's something like what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia the other day, where the city council met, and it was just basically a riot of chaos, and the local government wasn't able to do what they thought they were going to do that night,
Right.
and the public came in and just basically used it as an opportunity to demonstrate. So I think that's a good thing, and if that's the case, then that resolves some of my concerns regarding the comment that it says on page C. Let's see, this would be page, the numbering here. I guess this would be 4, A, B, C, D, C, 4C, before 5. Commissioners should refer people with questions or complaints to the county administrator, explaining that they are not satisfied with the results of that meeting. They should ask to be put on a board meeting agenda. Well, if this is during a board meeting, then I think we should say, in a board meeting, commissioners who are asked by the public for X, Y, or Z should refer them to the county administrator. Because to me, that seemed to be, if someone calls me up about complaining about Lane County, I'm supposed to take this to the county administrator. That's the way I'd read that. And maybe that wasn't a proper reading, because if the focus is on in a board meeting, then that to me has a different meaning. That sentence has a big different meaning than if it's not in a board meeting. The other thing I was going to point out is that it looks like you've had a pretty good review of the charter and the open meetings, but the Oregon ethics statutes and the rules of the Ethics Commission, and more significantly, all the rulings of the Ethics Commission, they have just been putting out a ton of stuff about what public officials can do, can't do. And one of the things that I think is great about this is that, again, for someone that parachutes in, either by appointment or they've just been elected, this will give them, if we really zero in on, again, the role of the elected officials with actual or potential conflicts of interest, it'll tell us what to say. It'll tell us what to back out of. And I would just say that as you've done a really good review of the charter and open meetings issues, I think that the ethics statute, rules, and case law should be looked at so that we're able to use this document as a way to acquaint staff and commissioners and the public to these responsibilities. So they don't think we're wimping out when we say we have an actual conflict or a potential conflict, that we're not taking part in something because it's a tough decision, but it's really required that we not do it or that we disclose it. And I would like to see, since the focus is on the actual meetings of the Board of Commissioners, I'd like to see that part expanded.
So for clarification, we do have a section on conflicts of interest, and we define an actual conflict and a potential conflict in the document per ORS 244.020. You're wanting us to expand upon that?
Well, I guess I would just say I would like to make sure that we're encompassing what the Ethics Commission thinks these terms actually mean, as opposed to the statute that says what they mean. But now we've had a commission that has been critical of public officials who, I think, through no fault of their own most of the time, say the wrong thing or don't get out of an issue that somehow later it becomes an issue. And I think that there have been a lot of legislative complaints against the commission because of their, let's say, zealous enforcement of those words.
Commissioner, what I can tell you, when I looked at this, we were trying to strike a balance in terms of detail, like you mentioned, the public meetings thing. My thought would be, and I actually made a note on this section on conflict of interest, to generically incorporate. It would be something that would capture both the statute and the decisions of the Oregon Government Ethics Commission, something along the lines of as required by Oregon law, whatever it is. Same sort of thing with the meeting notice. What we were trying to avoid was turning this document into incorporating into the detail the Oregon Public Meetings Act. Right? That's not very useful because this thing would be, 60 pages long. So we're really, and to that extent, I agree with you. I think if we do some more general things, which says, for example, just what it says here, that meetings will be noticed according to the Oregon Public Meetings Act.
Well, we actually notice stricter than that.
Well, I guess we do. We have to at a minimum comply with that. That's what I'm
And the
trying to
charter.
say.
About
And the charter, and the Oregon Government Ethics Commission Act. I mean, there's a whole bunch of.
Yeah. And by the way, all these questions are just things to think about. They're not in any way critical of this at all. I think it's a great thing to have this board order.
Well, and this is what we're looking for,
Yes.
is comments.
I also wanted to bring up the topic of the administrative role of the Board of Commissioners. Unlike cities in Lane County, the Lane County Charter gives the Lane County Board of Commissioners both administrative and legislative powers, and we rarely get involved in administration. Most of our administrative authority has been delegated to the county administrator, which I think is appropriate. But I also think that it's appropriate for the board to recognize, and to the extent that we're talking about something outside of a meeting, that we recognize there is a administrative authority in the Board of Commissioners, not in any one commissioner, but in the Board of Commissioners. And I think that might be a tension here, like if this is applying outside of board meetings, then maybe that's not that important because it's, if it's defined as, this is during meetings, getting ready for meetings, having good, lawful, public-spirited meetings, then maybe that's not an issue. But I do think that a recognition that, at least heretofore, the board has not given up its, and the public has not changed the charter to make sure that the board still retains administrative responsibilities.
Right, this is not,
Yeah, I was trying to think, I'm trying to think of an example of when, I think one thing that comes out of this is making it crystal clear when these rules are intended to apply, like you said. Noticing a meeting and during the conduct of the meeting or whatever. Can you think of I'm trying to think of a situation where the board during a meeting would exercise administrative authority. I'm just trying to think of one.
I can't think of one. Maybe hiring the county performance auditor will be an example.
I suppose that's true. Personnel, but yeah, that would be acting
Hiring the county
hiring the
council.
administrator, county council. Yeah, that's true.
and we do have a section in there that does say that you have the authority in hiring personnel, but let me see if I can find it while we move on. But yeah, we can make it more.
I think that another issue I think would be helpful is you have county staff, you have the board, commissioners, you have our values, you have the public in the decorum part. But I think it might be helpful to have kind of a section devoted to the public and a section devoted to labor and management issues. In my time on the board, we've had a lot of problems where people come into the board and they're using public comment as a way to be involved in the labor management function. They'll come and say, you should treat us fairer or better. And while that would be completely appropriate for a taxpayer to come in and say, you should treat us fairer, that is different than when people who have legal issues, land use, labor management, and maybe labor management shouldn't be the title, but maybe with people with a special reason for coming to the Board of Commissioners, as opposed to the general public, who I think we really want to open it up. And so the problem with just keeping those things kind of mushed together and saying, come one, come all, everybody gets 3 minutes, we're going to have a public comment period, we welcome your ideas, we welcome your feedback on issues far and wide. The problem with that is that it isn't recognizing the unique role of the Board of Commissioners when it's in a quasi-judicial role, when it's in a executive session, dealing with real estate, when it's in a labor management kind of picture. So I want the idea of openness and people coming in from the public with legitimate issues for the board, defined by them as legitimate. But I don't think that we might as well acknowledge the fact that we've got land use issues, we've got people with lawsuits, we've got people with reasons to come in, and we ought to have rules for them that are different than the rules for the public. In fact, there have been times when people have come in and said, I'm suing you guys, and of course we knew that because we had already met with the lawyer on the topic, and I'm suing you guys and I want you to do right by me. And we've had that before. And so I think that maybe I would take that decorum section and I would use that entire decorum and order section, but I would want to distinguish the public's right to come into board meetings and our willingness to put our 3-minute comment rule into writing, and I want to distinguish that from people who have, and this is going to be not a lawyerly term, but some angle with us that is where they're using the public comment really inappropriately. And we've even had county councils that have had to say, oh, by the way, I see Mr. I'll say Jones, but it wasn't Jones. Mr. Williams come into the board meeting, and I see Mr. Williams there, not this Mr. Williams, a hypothetical Mr. Williams, come into the board meeting, and I just want you to know, Board Chair Pete Sorensen, that you've got to tell him he can't talk to the board about his land use appeal or whatever. You know, so I've had to shut people down myself as a commissioner, as a board, as a chair, when county council said, and the guy came and said, hey, you said on your website that the public can come in and give 3 minutes. Well, that's not really true, and that's why I think it should be distinguished.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's move down the queue a little bit.
Yeah.
That's a pretty long and
That's a long list.
many points were covered during that.
I would take a
I'm
look.
going to have to yield to you on that one. So I don't-
Yeah, I was going to say, Commissioner, if you take a look at the, I think with a little bit of modification, the last paragraph on page 4 might deal with that. And I was thinking I could add that to include.
Is that in the decorum and order?
Yeah, it says county commissioners not get involved in personnel issues, and I could add in there, or legal issues, including but not limited to. It's the very last.
Yeah, my concern isn't that commissioners are involved with those issues, it's that people come into board meetings.
Well, and I guess it sort of kind of goes that way.
Well, and I guess you're going to need to define that for public comment. I don't know how we would rewrite the public comment section to say, this is 3 minutes of public comment to come in, except for the following.
And I think it is, the reason that it's been written this way is that it is difficult, even in those situations, to constrain the person's right to speak. The one thing we do have control over is our response. And I think what I hear you saying is, it would be nice to have something in here that you as a commissioner could point to and say, the reason I'm not going to engage you is we have a rule that says when you discuss personnel or legal matters or whatever it is, you have a right to speak, but I'm not being rude when I don't engage.
And if this thing is in the back of the room, a tattered copy or so,
Which
if it's in the back of the room, it'll tell people a little bit more than they otherwise would know.
Right.
I'm not in favor of restricting speech. The way I've seen that done in other bodies is that you cannot speak to an issue that's on the agenda during the public comment section.
Well, and that's what I'm saying.
It's for a vote on the agenda.
It is very difficult. Excuse me. I think it is really difficult to restrict people from talking.
And I don't know how I would
It's the
do
only
that.
thing you can control is your response, and I think that's the way you want to phrase it.
There is a way to accomplish, I think, what I'm hearing Commissioner Sorensen say, and that is not by restricting people from doing things, but by saying the board's expectation, because what we're trying to do in this document is say, here's our expectation for the board and individual commissioners. Here's our expectation for staff. I think it's fair for the board to say, here's our expectation for the public, labor, appellants, applicants, and others that come before the board who have an interest. We expect that you're going to act in a similar way that we hold ourselves, with the similar expectation that we hold ourselves to. There's certain things that if you act in a certain way or address certain issues, we won't be able to respond to. So I think the question is, if you're setting expectations for yourself and for your staff as part of these.
So we do have under C, we say employees of the county and other persons attending board meetings will observe the same rules of procedures, decorum, and good conduct applicable to the members of the board.
That covers it, yeah. And the chair, having that language in hand, can just use that discretionarily. Once again, as Steve said, our response is what we can 100% control. And the other thing that we have control of is this is a 3-minute dissertation that people give. And at the end of 3 minutes, when the time's up, the 3 minutes are gone, the words are gone. So my feeling is, as a Eugene City Councilor, if you ever watch those Eugene City Council meetings, I've been accused of being everything from a Nazi all the way to, that's probably the worst. But, and not just me, the other councillors sitting beside me, and I sitting next to Kevin Hornbuckle, who was a communist, and
By the way, that's not a slur. He was a communist.
Yes. Yeah, not a communist. He's a communist, right? No, actually, Kevin was a member of the American Communist Party, and people would direct comments at him. But after 2 minutes, or 3 minutes, which we usually observe, is it's over. And you don't have to worry about it, other than by not responding to it, as long as there hasn't been a legal breach, and at which point. So, Sid, you remember what you had to say?
I do. Mine's going to be a little bit shorter, I think. My view is, I think you really need to keep this broad. I don't get too detailed about this. This is decorum for the Board of Commissioners. And it's really up to the board then, when they're elected, to go through an orientation process, which includes going through an orientation process with legal counsel to get an idea. Because you know what? This is going to happen. Now, I got to tell you, it's few and far between when this happens, when people come and say, my God, I'm going to sue you over this. And it's not like it happens every single week, because it doesn't. The reality is, most of the comments that we get, people are passionate. We've seen many passionate folks, and they come before the board and they state their piece, whether it's right or wrong. Sometimes it's not. It's not correct. You can either take your remonstrance and correct them, or you can just take your remonstrance, look at them, and just let it go. And that's really up to the board. This is decorum for us. And the thing that happened in Oak Ridge, and the one thing I'm going to suggest is, be careful when you want to put cities in, because cities and city government, county government are different. And I have the experience here to tell you that as a board chair for 10 years, he was 12 years, at a city, it is completely different than what it is, say, here at the county. First of all, the city, remember, the police department is employed by the city. We have an independent elected sheriff. So with the city, what we were able to do is say, okay, police chief, under our operating rules, which again was designed for the city council, not for the public, you will be the sergeant of arms. Therefore, the mayor can look at you and say, that person that's getting a little bit out of control, would you escort them out? And then you can recess. I had the biggest standing room only crowd you can possibly imagine when they wanted to build a strip club in downtown Springfield, or open up a strip club next to the charter school. Remember those days, Devin?
I do.
Mm-hmm. And it was rambunctious, and especially when the applicant wanted to get up and speak. And I hit the gavel about as hard as I've ever hit it. And I said, this is the United States of America. He has an opportunity to come before. He has freedom of speech. And if anybody in this room disrupts him, the Sergeant of Arms is Jerry Smith right there. Well, you will be escorted out immediately. And I got to tell you, the whole audience went, whoop, because and that's what the board chair can do. Now, we can't just go to the sheriff and say, hey, independently elected sheriff, can you have one of your deputies come to be our sergeant of arms? It's not going to work that way. So we have to just use our own discretion. And the other thing about the decorum we have to remember is each of us have our own personalities. So we'll put our own personal piece as far as a board chair and how we operate. So the idea, and I would agree with Pat, I don't want to take away somebody's opportunity for speaking, even if it's something as ridiculous as I'm going to sue you because you built that culverts now, is something happened with it and I'm getting flooded. Well, you know what? It's up to us to show our own judgment, say, either we can respond to it or the chair can immediately say, sir, I'm sorry to hear that. Legal counsel's right here and we'll make sure that happens or that's dealt with. And then you're done. You don't say another word. Mm-hmm. You're done. So I think I like the idea of keeping it somewhat broad, but I would rather you focus more on county government decorum, not as much on city. While I appreciate the city of Springfield's operating policies, I enjoyed them. I got to tell you, if you wanted a work session, the mayor and council president had to go through them. You didn't have head nods. Those two had to be unanimous, and if they weren't unanimous, you didn't get it put on the work session. So that's why some councilors have funny word names for me, but that's okay. I was referred as a dictator at times, but that's okay. That's where I'm at on this. And I think what you have established here is really nice. This is good. And I think it's good. It's a good process for us and for our decorum. And I think overall, as long as we're being respectful to each other and to the public, I think that's really what people are going to remember more than anything else. What happened at Oak Ridge, clearly, that was a whole different scenario, very passionate. People are going to come before you, and they're going to turn around and talk to the audience instead of to the board. If you really want to get their attention, then if they want to turn around and talk to the audience, then you just start, playing on your phone and saying, he doesn't want to talk to us, so he's talking to you guys. 3 minutes up, great, thanks, you're done. You don't have to do that, but so that's how I view it. And so I like what you have established here. This is decorum. This is for us. This is for the board. And not necessarily for the public and how they should react or not react. We're just going to have to show our own judgment. And that's why I think when Gary was talking about his orientation process with the Public Works, I thought, yes, that's exactly what we should do. That's good. That was fantastic. I was glad you shared that with us, Gary, because that's important for all of us. And I think all of us have had that opportunity to do orientation with different departments, to know what they do, and then allows us to have judgment. Nobody's expecting us to be the master of all. Are you kidding me? I'm not going to do that. And the other thing I'll leave to you real quick, the reason why I think you focus on counties is because we're full-time. We're full-time commissioners. And as a mayor, you're part-time. Sometimes I didn't feel like that, but you're unpaid. And so you are relying on, then, city manager, can you have staff get in contact with this person and see if we can come up with a solution for their issue. And then you're done. That's all I have.
And what I'm hearing is, by and large, the way we do things is fine. It's just a real rare exception that we're trying to be prepared for. And by and large, we don't allow cheering, applause, or jeering during other people's testimony.
So in response to Sid, really quick, we did look at cities. We also looked at Multnomah County. We looked at Nevada was a county as well.
Yeah,
and we
I
did.
agree.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of let you know, one of the reasons you will not see anything in here about a sergeant of arms is because we do not have one.
No, exactly.
So the solution to that was the board can leave the room.
And many cities do have sergeant at arms.
Right.
That's how they operate.
Exactly. And so
we do have it, so the chair can recess it and say, you know what, we're going to recess for 5 minutes and we can just walk off.
And that it does give that permission in here. It just it reiterates things that we already know. Mostly this document was to extend courtesy to all people at a board meeting, from the staff that's there to the commissioners to the public. It was kind of just a document that was designed to say, look, we're all adults, we're going to be courteous to each other. There is the one section that is in there talks about clapping, cheering, things like that, which it is specific to those things are prohibited. So you might want to, if you don't want that in there.
What do they do now? Spirit fingers or something? I'm not sure. I've seen people do it.
I have
Sign language version of
I can tell you exactly.
Yeah, was that what it is?
I'll tell you exactly
Stupid
where it
me.
came from, too. But I typically said, no, none of this either.
Yeah.
Because that is just as intimidating to the person talking as yelling out loud.
Or just doing this.
Jay, go ahead.
Yeah,
and then,
so
I want to do something else.
I want to start out with a question. Yeah, yeah. I can imagine us as a board doing that.
Hey,
I want to
let's do
start
a
out with a
proposal.
thumbs up or thumbs down. Yeah. First is just a question. Didn't we deal with notification of the board on meetings in a separate board order that we pass annually now?
I believe so.
So could we distribute that so we can just know that that question's dealt with in some place other than this set of rules?
And I have
Because I
that.
think there was very clear things about how we try and contact, what the allowable ways of contacting the commissioner in an attempt to let them know about a meeting and what constitutes an attempt to contact the
And
commissioner.
I'll do that because I have that right at the thing. I sent it to Ms. Dugan as part of that.
Yeah,
Right, it
yeah,
was one
and
of
that's
our-
why I
right.
was pretty sure we did, and I thought because that came about as a discussion of what happens during an emergency,
Right.
you know, and we have all these rules about how to get how, and I think it meets what the charter says, where we try to contact everybody.
Right. And
So I think, rather than trying to wrap that into this set of rules, maybe just I don't know if a sideways reference to it makes it too complex, but just But know that we've dealt with notice, I think, separately, Pete. And hopefully that'll
I'll
be
send
the
that
next
out after
question.
the meeting to everybody.
And it is one of the routine orders that we
Review.
review.
So, more specifically, the section on conflict of interest, and I had one of our employees email me about this. It talks about removing, if you have an actual conflict, removing yourself from the table and refraining from participation. Removing from the table is above and beyond ORS. And that the question I have is, I think it's wise for somebody to step away from the table, maybe, but there is no requirement under ethics law. Once you've made your declaration and you just sit with your hands folded and you don't talk, you're actually adhering to ethics law. So I just want to point out that maybe that particular phrase might be worth pulling out of the documents.
Yeah, and that's totally fine. That would
Okay.
be up
Just-
to the board's discretion
Yeah.
if you instruct us to.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't
do that.
stop somebody from getting up and being off the dais during the discussion of something that has an actual conflict of interest. That's might be the wise thing to do, but I don't think we can ask people to remove themselves, because I think that goes past the ORS. And then kind of getting back to the section 6 on decorum and order, I'd like to split item B into two parts. Because there's the first part more or less talks about personal behavior of maybe the person that's addressing the board or something like that. The other part talks about the audience somewhat. And I think one of the things I think we also want to do is talk about signage and not bringing signage into board meetings. For me, and I don't know if we want to repeat something at the beginning of that paragraph about the audience and applause, et cetera, about the value the board places on people being able to engage the board without feeling intimidated. Because this isn't just about the Oak Ridge meeting, this is about the meeting we held in Bonita, where if I kind of had some of these tools, I would have probably stopped that meeting and pulled us out of the room for 5 minutes until the audience stopped applauding. People did not testify that night because they were afraid to. I got talked to after the meeting. There were several people that signed up and we called their name and they didn't respond. They were still in the room. They didn't want to speak because they were afraid to speak up, because they were going to speak up on the side that wasn't getting the cheers. And that to me is just wrong when people feel like they can't be engaged with. So I think a strong statement about our value of being able to engage your public body, without fear of intimidation, and how applause, no matter how well-meaning, including silent applause by sign language or even signs of support, can set up that environment where somebody feels intimidated to speak. And I think that's a value I hold very highly, and something we should make very clear, and should actually be a clear separate section.
So separate 6D into one part pertaining to the speaker, the other part pertaining to the balance of the audience.
Yeah, I think because that expectation that there's not going to be signage and there's not going to be cheering, and basically if people aren't going to adhere to that, you can pull the board out of the room for 5 minutes and come back and see if they're going to adhere to it. But I got handed the gavel that night for that meeting out there in Bonita, and I could not control that. And as many times as I kept stopping the meeting to say, please don't cheer, it stayed out of hand. And I wish, kind of, if I'd had these rules at the time and had thought about it and had a little bit more warning, I should have just stopped the meeting at one point, marched us off into one of the back rooms at that facility, and waited for a little bit and came back and said, okay, we're going to stop cheering. Because if not, this will be, we're going to end this hearing now.
Well, Commissioner Sorensen mentioned the most recent one, but I think we've all seen on the news a couple of these and these different places where these things have gotten completely out of control.
I've seen a meeting of the Eugene City Council where one of the people testifying jumped up on the table and refused to get off the table and leave the meeting room. Over the sleeps protest stuff. So it hasn't just been Charlottesville and other places. There's been local meetings that have been, and I know one of our commissioners actually disrupted a meeting of Crestwell City Council at one point.
I like how you sort of put that, though, that we lead that section by saying we're seeking to create an environment that is free from fear and intimidation,
Right.
to allow everybody. Therefore, we don't allow signage.
I don't
we
want to
don't allow
make it sound like we're just trying to
Right,
suppress
exactly.
people's, expression, but the point is, it makes it really tough if you suddenly realize you're the minority opinion and everyone's cheering for the majority opinion to stand up there and speak.
Well, and it's important to remember that a lot of people are intimidated just speaking in public,
Yeah,
Right.
let
whether
alone,
there's anybody there opposed or not. And
yeah,
you've all
let
seen
alone if the
that.
person before them says something that's in opposition of them and half the audience is all,
And in fact, most of the potential issues are going to come up during public comment session.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, the board itself, we hold the call quite well.
or a public hearing.
Yeah.
Which at that night in Benito was a public hearing and Oak Ridge was a public hearing. And
Gary?
Thank you. There have been several references to this. A month or so ago, we had a very full Harris Hall. Very concerned people filled the hall. Most of them were leaning in a certain direction. And there were 2 people that signed up to speak. And when their name was called, they did not speak. And I can only suppose that those 2 speakers were in the other camp from the majority of the people that were in the room, all doing this. And I really do think that there was, we get back to that intimidation factor, that the 2 people that didn't step up and take advantage of the microphone probably were the antithesis of what the rest of the speakers were speaking to. And so this in itself can be intimidating. T-shirts can be intimidating too. You can't really govern dress like United Airlines does. But I'm put off a little bit by that too, because that's just a silent clapping, and it's somewhat grating on me. But I do believe that there's an intimidation there, and there were 2 people that, for whatever reason, chose not to speak and signed up to do that, and I was concerned about that.
That's a good point. And like I say, that is as intimidating as verbal.
So is there teeth to put into the decorum of the procedures, that's not acceptable?
I think that's actually in
We do
there.
have part of that in there. It says, I was going to ask about this because right now the section says the person may be removed, and I'm not sure how we would remove a person as opposed to the board would leave, but we do restrict the stamping of feet, whistles, yells, and clapping are not permitted. It says such people may be barred from further audience, and in aggravated cases, an appropriate complaint shall be issued to the chair. Now we can add
Other gestures.
other gestures, yeah, and I also like Jay's, or Commissioner Bozovich's comment about leading it in an effort to be less intimidating and fair. These things will not be acceptable in a meeting. And if they do happen, what do we do? Does the board clear the room, or do we ask, because right now we're saying we can remove the person, and I'm not sure that's the right.
Well,
route to
there's
do.
one woman who always does it. I know who she is and I know her name. And really a statement directed exactly at a person, while not intimidating, can actually single them out and let them think about themselves personally and what they are doing. And, as a soccer referee, what you do is if you got somebody fouling, you take them aside and say, now, the reason we have a dangerous play call is because, and then you explain it to them. The reason we don't allow this, the reason we don't want you doing that is because every single person needs to have the same opportunity, the same level of dignity to talk. So, Gary, go ahead.
I can sum it up in 2 words: overt demonstration. It just can't be done. You just sit on your hands and behave yourself, and you can frown. I suppose you can raise your eyebrows, but the rest of it is distracting, intimidating, and at least annoying.
Can you include eye roll in there?
Every teenager banned from our meetings.
Yeah, what about I've gone on pretty long the first round here, so before I start in, if anybody else has anything to say or ask a question before I start in on my second round.
Does it include swiveling?
It includes swiveling. Swiveling was specifically mentioned. So anyway, here's my round two. I like the idea of Sid brought this up, of kind of making this really focused on the board. And I think that really is a way to minimize this document. And in that tone, you've got quite a bit on staff in here, okay? And if you're going to take out the public and what the public can do or not do, if that's part of this, then I feel like the thing is really aimed at the board, then references to what the county administrator will do, what the county staff will do, it seems to me aren't in keeping with the trimmed down what the board's going to do. Just think about that. Another is, there isn't much mention of executive session, and maybe there doesn't need to be, because if all these rules apply to the board when it's meeting, it's meeting when it's in private or executive session. Maybe it doesn't need to be stated, but I'll bring that up as an issue of, do we want to talk about the executive session or not. Another one is that the board acts through, in my view, three formal things. One, we have motions for orders, we have motions for resolutions, we have motions for ordinances. And I think if the public knew that there were three things this board usually does, have orders, have ordinances, and have resolutions, then that would maybe help the commissioners who parachute in. What do? Well, you vote on motions, orders, and motions for orders, motions for resolutions, and motions for ordinances. That may or may not be, in keeping with the streamlined part of this, but it might be in keeping with the what does the board do and how do you do it function. Another idea was this business of signage, clapping, middle fingers, all kinds of ways that people kind of express themselves. And this is more of a question than a comment, is that if the focus of this is on the board, then do we want to say that? Do we want to have any comment about that? If the focus of this is on the board meeting and the role of the public in it, do we want to have an explanation of it? And then this is the legal part of it, and that is, what are the boundaries of acceptable behavior? If I grimace at the person, well, that's maybe appropriate for this if we're going to talk about what the commissioners do. The commissioners shouldn't be doing the grimacing, or as we did today, clapping. One thing is aimed at the commissioners. The other thing is aimed at the public, what the public can do or can't do. And again, I just, looking at this thing from the perspective of maybe where the First Amendment litigation is. Can I come to a board meeting and not say anything and just say, Pete Sorensen should be removed from office? Okay. Now under this, I can have this person removed, which possibly would be a good thing in that case. But what I'm saying is, isn't that some kind of expression that the person is doing? And yes, it's intimidating to those many thousands of people who would be legitimately offended by such a demonstration of political point of view. But on the other hand, isn't that the right of the person? So I'm not giving an opinion on all this. I'm letting our real lawyer do
Well,
that.
I can tell you, Commissioner, it's one of my jobs when I was a district attorney was, deputy district attorney was assigned to issues like that. And so I actually became very familiar with it. And the first floor is criminal behavior, which should be obvious. I mean, you always have the right if someone is engaging in criminal behavior to remove them. But I will tell you that the courts have given extremely, the example, there's a case out of, I believe it's Clackamas County, the very issue that you're talking about.
Well,
The
I
person-
beat that one.
Yeah. Well, no, what it was that the person, and I don't remember what their gripe was, but essentially they wanted to, there were 2 or 3 commissioners that they said were crooks and whatever. So these people showed up at every single meeting and so there would be a public hearing about a land use ordinance. They'd come to the microphone and they would go, I just want to say, Commissioner X, you're a crook, you're a thief, you're a scoundrel, you should be impeached, you should be shot, you should be dead. So they finally got enough of it and they said, okay, we're going to throw you out because you're not sticking to the agenda. And the court said no. So the final non-criminal other line is essentially when they have said when they start stepping on other people's things. So in other words, that guy standing at the podium, speaking at the public hearing on the land use thing, and his tirade against the commissioners didn't impose on anybody else. It's when they start, not letting other people speak or shouting over them. But it's got to be pretty extreme, I will tell you.
I did think that the example of a person coming to the board meeting with a big sign and holding the sign up that blocked the view of other people.
I think that would be.
And that's separate from whether I like the sign or not. It's now intimidating the other people attending the meeting. I really don't know what the boundaries are. I will just say that I think that we should do research on that before we kind of take the final.
That's a good point.
thing
It's
on that.
content neutral. That's what they're saying. When you're screaming at the top of your lungs, it's content neutral. When you block the view, it's content neutral.
Steve Justin, to say that point.
And may I just finish one more thing, and that is when I was chair, this goes back a few years now, we had some really awful board meetings that were comparable to the Oak Ridge meeting in terms of people demonstrating, clapping, yelling at specific commissioners. I called the sheriff up and said, hey, these meetings are getting really raucous, and can you be our sergeant at arms at the meeting? He says, sure, be happy to. So I have on my list of things, since the focus, we're trying to put the focus here on the board in the board meeting. What do we do? One of the things I do think we should do is have a sergeant at arms provision. Because this business of asking someone to leave the meeting, like the Oak Ridge police tried to do up in Oak Ridge, it's really a tough call. And this thing leaves it to the chair, on who to do. But to actually carry it out, you really have to have somebody that knows what they're doing. And I think the sheriff would be willing to do this. It arises very rarely, fortunately, but when it does arise, it's really needed. So I think we ought to think about, having a conversation with the sheriff. Again, in my experience, not with this sheriff, but with others, of course they're willing to do this function, and didn't they come to Veneta? They weren't in Veneta.
Yeah, they were in Oak Ridge too.
They were in Oak Ridge too. Lake County Sheriff was in Oak Ridge?
Yes.
Sheriff and this Oak Ridge Police.
Oh, okay. I thought it was just the Oak Ridge Police.
I think there was a sheriff.
The sheriff's office was outside.
Two
the
deputies.
They were
building,
outside,
and
okay,
Oak Ridge,
yeah.
he was in
Yeah,
the-
so at any rate, I think it's worth a discussion with the sheriff's office, with the sheriff, about what language he's comfortable with. It's when called upon. It's not every meeting. It's not right here in our open Tuesday afternoon meeting. It's when there's a real need for it. But then we have this tool, it is available, and it's something that does protect the public. Because remember, in these awful incidents when they get out of control, among the people that are threatened are A, the elected officials, B, the staff, and C, the public, and D, the law enforcement. They're all at risk. of a physical injury if the meeting continues to be disruptive and people get more and more angry, and pretty soon chairs are being thrown and guns are being taken out. And so it's something that you need to plan for. And so rather than saying, well, we can't do that because we can't tell the sheriff what to do. Well, the sheriff wants to protect the public peace, and I just think that they view that as part of their role, is making sure that county meetings are run without danger, and you know, it's not going to come up very often, but like Veneta and Oak Ridge, which are recent examples where it's uncomfortable, it's harder to perform our job, it's harder for staff to perform their job, and it's harder for the people who want to give public comment on whatever issue it is, it's harder for them. So I just think that part of the revision of this and the improvement to it should be at least a discussion in nay or yay on whether to include the sheriff. But I personally think, you know, in this day and age, you know, we need to plan for that Charlottesville City Council. We need to plan for that. Hopefully it won't happen. Hasn't happened. We've had a lot of bad things happen, but nothing on that scale. And maybe just for scenario purposes, we ought to say, well, gee, you know, if that happened to us, you know, in 3 weeks, I just wish that we would just quit the meeting. That to me would be a better way of handling it than to take that kind of abuse from the public and then have nothing. There was no outcome. There was nothing good happened at the meeting. There was a lot of anger being expressed. So to me, the law enforcement wouldn't be the appropriate thing. The appropriate thing would be to just shut the meeting down. But I'm just saying, I do see a need for putting the sheriff in this board meeting, this thing. But anyway, I'm done with my second round point.
Okay, Gary, go ahead. And Steve, you had something to say about 3 points ago to Pete, so go ahead.
Well, in some smaller communities, and probably larger ones too, the chambers where the governing body meets is also the chambers for planning commissions and courts and those things. Under my administration in Cottage Grove, we had several serious incidences in City Hall, more than one or two, where things got pretty rambunctious, and we installed a panic button at the chair's desk, where when you needed to, you know, when things got out of control and you didn't, you know, you were feeling threatened, push the button and the dispatch right next door would send an officer or several in just to, most times their presence calmed things down immediately. That I would suggest, I'm not sure about the logistics of this, we may already have a panic button, I don't know. That would be one of those things that's like a doorbell. You just, you know, you push it, it's the chair has it, it's innocuous, nobody knows except the first responders that there's something going on in chambers that's a little spooky. So, just throw that out.
Isn't the panic button Diana's cell number?
No, Dana is the panic, but we don't even need to push it. Steve, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I'd like to just maybe try to synthesize a couple of these points here and then get some direct. This has been a really good discussion. But I've heard sort of different opinions voiced about whether or not we should include expectations for the public in here. So we'll need some direction on that. But the two issues that I've heard a number of commissioners, and particularly Commissioner Sorensen, talk about is one, enforcement, and two, expectation, which are kind of setting expectation and then how do we enforce. So I'll take the enforcement piece first, which I think in a lot of ways is the more difficult thing for the board to work through. It happens in very rare instances, I think you said, Commissioner Lycan, and you know, maybe twice in the past 2 years we've had public hearings where we've had to have law enforcement there and have to sort of wrangle with that issue. You can have, and we have, and I'll use Oak Ridge as an example, we had both Oak Ridge PD and the Sheriff's Office present there. So law enforcement will provide a presence if we request it. They will take direction from the chair of the board on when to intervene. And that was really the issue that happened in Oak Ridge, was there was a miscommunication between the Oak Ridge PD, the Oak Ridge police officer, and the chair, Commissioner Stewart at the time. And Commissioner Stewart wasn't really clear. He thought the law enforcement officer was just going to act on their own accord. And the law enforcement officer thought he was at the direction of the chair of the board. And so there was sort of nonverbal communication that occurred, gestures, and the Oak Ridge police officer took that to mean intervene, and that wasn't what the chair had actually requested. And then, of course, I think the way it was handled, and the vice chair intervened very appropriately to de-escalate the situation. So without any rules in place, it actually, I think, worked out okay, and the best part of human nature prevailed in that case. So you can, and we have, I think, done a fairly good job of preparing for those instances where we want law enforcement personnel to be present. I think what we need to do is get a little bit clearer around what are the expectations that we have. So on that piece, on the expectation piece, what we really need to get direction from the board here on is, do you want to define expectations for the public or not? I will say that if you don't put any language in here about whether or not you expect that the public can or can't have signage, or can or can't do this, or can or can't have verbal demonstrations outside of the particular comments, it may expect variation in enforcement. Because depending on who the chair is at the time and how they choose to enforce that, it'll be up to their discretion. If you want to set clear expectations about, we don't think that it creates an environment free from fear and intimidation if you have signs, and if you do this, and if you need to put it in here. And because then the board will adopt it, it becomes board policy, and regardless of who the chair is, the chair will be obligated to at least set the expectation. And that's the other piece of this. We have to know that the vast majority of people who come to our meeting are not going to know this even exists unless we post it in a really prominent place. The way that they'll know is if it's addressed in advance of public comment at the start of the meeting by the chair. And the way to make sure that the chair knows and is consistent year after year, meeting to meeting, on what the policy is to put it in here.
Language.
Right. So then the question ultimately, if you do that, the question becomes enforcement. And what do you do in those situations when people bring in signage? And I think, my experience has been the vast majority of people comply with the expectation that you set without having to actually enforce it. You're going to have some anomalies like we had in Oak Ridge, and like you had in Veneta, where a handful of folks may not comply, and then you have to make a judgment call. Do you have law enforcement, or do you do something, or do you just sort of let that go, knowing that enforcing it could escalate the situation? But at least by documenting it in here, what the expectations of the board are, it gives the chair the ability at the front end to say, and you said this, Commissioner Lycan, that when you were mayor, you set the expectation up front and people complied with it. Mm-hmm. So hopefully the vast majority of the time, if you choose to do that, that's how people will handle it. So I'd like, because I heard different things about whether or not you did or didn't want expectations for the public in this document.
I think 6D might, and I've not said anything yet, so on 6D kind of covers it. And with Jay's suggestion that 6D be separated into two sections, one to the speaker and the other to the balance of the audience. And it does cover, it covers physical signs as well as outward shows of emotion through voice. So to me, that sets the expectation right there. And it's just a matter of the board chair, if it looks like it's going to be an issue, to bring it up. The other thing that I've seen done is just a short sentence right at the very top of the sign-up sheet saying, just outlining what the standards of behavior for the audience are when someone else is speaking. So that being said, we had a meeting a couple of months ago where I did have, at the start of the meeting, I had to remind people, no signs, no physical waving their fingers. And at one point during the meeting, I did remind people, no signs, and the signs were laid down, including the one, vote for me next time the commission race is on. So, I believe that 6D does cover it, and by and large, I think we have a pretty operable document here. The one that I do have a question on is one that Commissioner Sorensen raised, and that was it was 4C, which is commissioners should refer people with questions or complaints to the county administrator. I'm not really clear as to when that takes effect. Is that?
Again, this is during the board.
During the meeting, okay, all right. So that being said, I'm okay by and large with the document as it is, with that small adjustment that Commissioner Sorensen made, and sending this to the Policy Procedure Committee. Thank you, and bring it back. So bring it back to the board in a month.
Yeah, I'm also in favor of it going to policies and procedures to work through all these things. As to Steve's comment, I think that if we're going to be clear that this is about the Board of Commissioners and what the board does, then it's really a matter of, what we should be doing when people clap, what we should be doing when people do this or that. If there's interest in having it on what the public is supposed to do, then I think some of the comments I made about people that have business with the board, that are talking about real estate, or they're talking about litigation, or they're talking about labor management issues, those aren't appropriate for public comment, and these issues are, and please limit your remarks to 3 minutes, and we do have a commitment to public comment and 3-minute public comment. And if you're going to use it, you got to be polite and direct, but not rude, and no stamping of feet, and no this or that. But so I think the Policies and Procedures Committee has to really, work this out. Is it about the board in the board meeting, or is it about the board, the staff, and the public in the board meeting? So, some of my comments were, well, if it's about the board in the board meeting, that narrows it down. That accommodates some of the concerns that it could get too big and wordy. But I will ask you this. In paragraph 6D, and I'm reading this by taking out a few words, it says, any person who makes an unauthorized remark may be removed from the room. What does that mean?
That was actually a question that I just posed a bit ago too. I personally think that needs to be taken out of there.
Yeah.
Because, and it goes back to Steve's comment about enforcement. How do we... I think the solution is if it gets to the point where you think a person should be removed from the room, the board.
My wife, without knowing it's attributed to Justice White, said regarding my views on some topics, she knows it when she sees it. So I know what an unauthorized remark is. It's one I don't really like at the time it's stated, in the inappropriate forum that it's stated in. But it does, again, come up to the problem of, well, then who's going to decide what that really is? And if that's getting at some of my issues of labor management, real estate, litigation, I've got a pending appeal with you, then to me that falls into unauthorized remark. But if it's I love Donald Trump or I hate Donald Trump, no, those aren't unauthorized because they get to say that. So that's what I would be wary of using that term. Now I think impertinent, slanderous, personal, boisterous, those are a little bit more capable of definition than unauthorized.
Right, I think I've heard clearly, I think 6D will be rewritten before policies and procedures to remove some of this language, but to add Commissioner Bozovich's language about people being able to engage without intimidation and feel safe and things like that, and outlining kind of, I've heard people say, overt demonstrations, other gestures, clapping, stomping, kind of putting those things in there. And then, so that paragraph, I think I'm hearing, will need to be reworked a little bit to keep some of those things in there and add a different tone. I will let legal kind of defer on this. I don't know that it would be appropriate to remove someone from a board meeting. I think it's easier for them, if it gets out of control, for the board
I would never call for
to
removal.
step out.
So what I was going to suggest is before, it's policies and procedures on the 8th, is that right?
Yes.
What I'm going to do is just do some research and see if I can get a better, come in with some clearer parameters and some examples. I'm just going off my memory, and I remember that the courts gave wide deference to people in these public meetings, like I said, when they were, like it's talking about a commissioner during the public hearing, or during the public hearing on land use matters at an unauthorized remark, because it's out of order. That sort of thing. So hopefully I'll be able to
Are
provide.
we going to commit to the 3-minute public comment? Are we going to give the public that right?
We already do. That's part of our agenda.
I mean, if
Unless, that it's up to the chair. He
Yeah.
can make it a shorter period time allowed.
Based
We
on
allow
number.
for a public period.
Yeah, I just feel like if we're back to this minimalist idea of this board order being about the board and what we're doing, and if we're going to give the public the opportunity to come in for a public comment, we're going to tell them what they cannot do during the public comment or during the meeting, then that's separate from what we're doing.
I don't think it's just what the board does, it's what happens during a board meeting.
Right, I viewed it as decorum of
Yeah.
all parties participating in the meeting, including the county administrator, including staff, including the public, and including the board.
And ultimately, it's the confidence of the board chair to know that they're acting appropriately in terms of response to the audience. And if the board chair has a document to support their actions, then it's that they have that personal confidence. Some board chairs, some mayors and board chairs may be less inclined to be confrontational. But if it's not confrontational if you're just reminding people of the rules. You don't have to, it's not your own personal judgment. We simply do not allow signs to be held up. So please put a sign down.
And a lot of it goes away when you do it ahead of time so that it's not perceived as responsive to the one issue that's in front of you. If you hold, if you adopt this and it's 6 months in the future and you state that rule, it seems fair because you're saying, I didn't make this up for you guys. We adopted this 6 months ago.
Yeah, it's just like reminding the kids of bedtime. Bedtime is 9 o'clock. You know that. It's embarrassing to have to tell you that. Jay, then to you.
Yeah. So, just want to put my 2 cents in so you know what my recommended guidance is I don't quite agree with Commissioner Sorensen. This needs to be focused on board behaviors. I think there is some expectation from the public and staff about how meetings are run. I can cite examples where staff got sideways on stuff, like offering opinions on things they shouldn't have been offering opinions on, and where staff has taken advantage of public comment sometimes to blur the line between their private opinion and their role as a county employee. So I think it's wise to have it in general decorum. One of the things I did a lot of research on public participation and a lot of coaching of Tim Lowey at one point when Deb Frisch was showing up at PSCC meetings and giving public testimony at every PSCC meeting, basically to defame various staff members up and down the whole public safety system in her usual foul-mouthed way. Public meetings law, and this is straight out of Oregon, a publication from the state of Oregon. Public meetings law guarantees the public's right to attend governing body meetings, but does not include the right to participate. So we don't even have to supply the 3 minutes and all that stuff. There are some places where we're required to hold a public hearing, but one of the things that eventually shut that down was Tim stated before, because PSCC has their public comments supposed to be to the agenda. Was the way, that it's not just a generalized public comment. So he basically said, I'm going to take public comment, you need to speak to the agenda, and if you start defaming, personnel going outside the agenda, I will shut you down. And Deb's, and he said, so I only have one person signed up to speak, Deborah Frisch, and she's like, oh, well, those rules I can't talk. And it was the last time she came to PSCC. And it was just about defining those rules up front, and it shut that down. A very disruptive person. You didn't ever get to deal with her so much, but there's that balance. Yes, there's been times where the courts have ruled pretty much that you can say whatever you want, whenever you want from a public body, but we don't always have to, have that opportunity. I really value that public comment period and people's ability to address their government, which is why I so greatly value being able to do it without feeling intimidation, being able to express an opinion to us even if it's not the popular opinion in the room at the time. And that's what's important to me, is making sure people have that comfort to do so. So having rules of conduct. Yes, we may run into some First Amendment issues. If somebody wants to hold up a sign or whatever, and they claim it was political speech, that doesn't stop us as a board from walking out of the room if they can. It's a suggested rule of behavior. If people won't adhere to our suggested rules, we can just choose not to continue with the meeting. It's not like we're mandating that they don't have a sign. We're asking people not to hold up signs because of that respect we're looking for.
Okay, that's pretty much the summation of it.
So can I just ask for just a little more direction before I walk out? Because I will go and edit this and author it and bring it to policies and procedures. But if I can get head nods towards which way I should proceed, do you want it to be a document that contains all staff, public, and the board, or do you want it to be a board document? I'm not sure which way to head at this point.
Explain that.
I've heard comments about if it's a document just for the board and how they behave at the board meetings, then I would strip out the other things. Or do you want it to be an encompassing document for anyone who's participating at board meetings?
The latter.
Right, I guess
not that the entire document has to be produced at every board meeting, but the parts that are pertinent to the public should be what the public should be well aware of it. The decorum regarding interaction regarding
so
numbers.
you want staff expectations left in there. You want public expectations left in there. Or do you want it just to be talking?
If it's staff expectations as the expectations pertain to their participation in board meetings.
Right, which
yes.
is what it is now.
Yeah, not how they operate when they're getting ready for a board
these are,
meeting.
again, the staff's role during the board meeting.
I see.
And I don't want to come across as advocating a position on this, because I'm not really, but think about your board meetings, and I understand the desire to just have these reflect the board's conduct, but these are your board meetings. These are your business meetings to conduct the business of the people that you've been elected to do. And having a document that only addresses how the board conducts itself in your board meetings doesn't address the entire meeting itself, right? You have to rely on your staff to act in a certain manner, and you have to rely on the public to understand kind of what the rules are and to comply with that as a general rule. So if you think about all of those constituencies and roles and responsibilities being part of the ultimate success of a meeting, maybe that helps just in terms of determining whether or not you want to have those involved. But that's what I've heard the majority, and I think I even heard Commissioner Sorensen have the discussion with the Policies and Procedures Committee, and we can maybe further refine that and clarify what those look like, expectations for the public and staff, and then bring that back to the board.
And at the same time, Steve, I would never expect as a chair to be telling the staff, hey, you shouldn't be doing it that way. At some point, I would probably later come to you and say, hey, I thought we had rules on this. But, it's not the job of the board chair to admonish staff in a board meeting.
Right, and that rule actually is in here. That you would, in here, it does talk about what is the protocol for, I think Commissioner Bozovich mentioned that a staff person gave an opinion on something they might not be qualified to give an opinion on. It talks about what kind of they're restricted to talking about during a meeting. It talks about, how you would work with county administrators. So
It's the board's opportunity to admonish the county administrator.
Right. So for now, I think I'm hearing I'll leave them in, and then we'll discuss it further at policies and procedures and refine them a
include
bit.
this quote. Did you hear what I just heard? I'll talk to you later about that. Steve.
As an example of the, the more inclusive idea that this is about board meetings and what staff does and what the public does and what commissioners do, the initial conversation was, no, this is about the board. So, I don't want my views to be constrained to that idea, because it sounds like people want to talk about the board meeting and what people do during board meetings. So I would be more in favor of really putting the focus of this document on that board meeting, and that would include the sheriff, that would include, stopping the meeting if it's not fair to people, not fair to the commissioners, not fair to the public. It would include all the ethics stuff, but an example where this draft to me goes outside of those parameters would be county staff will provide written analysis and information on all agenda items prior to board meetings, as opposed to staff will be available to answer questions from commissioners during board meetings. Okay, so I would be striking words like prior to. I would have words like during. I would not have all about the written analysis, because that's outside the board meeting. So I would be, in an effort to kind of zero in on the board meeting, I would be taking out things that are happening outside of board meetings. That would be an example. And I think that committing to public comment for board meetings would be a commitment to that. If that's something that the board thinks is important, I think we should say it. I also think we should say that a copy of this will be at the back of the board meeting, so that we can say to people, look, we don't have time to tell you all about board meetings and what happens and doesn't happen in board meetings, but we've got some guidance for you, and among things, we don't want political demonstrations during board meetings. We don't want demonstrations. That's another thing about, can you put something in there like that a demonstration is that disrupts the meeting is not lawful? I mean, that's what really these things come down to, is people are overtly demonstrating in favor or against something, and it's disrupting the meeting. That's happened in my experience here.
The one they had on the one I saw the other night, people brought bullhorns. Which just ended it.
Yeah, well, you might want to put there no bullhorns. So that people who, because I think that these things come up just so rapidly, and they're so horrible that people don't really know what to do. And I think cutting the meeting is probably the safest thing to do, but, in the land use arena, people have come, they've paid money for a hearing, they're having a hearing, and it's not fair. They've got their experts there, they've spent a lot of money and a lot of time in preparation, and then just have people disrupt it is unfair. But I think overall, this is a good thing to have a board order that tells, the rules of the road, and it helps staff, it helps the board, it helps the public.
Well, Diana, are you clear on that then? So the next step will be to revise the document, and the policy and procedure
I'll
committee will
work
look at
with
that.
Steve Dingle on getting some of the ethics language in there, and refining some of the language a bit, and I will run it by Steve Monkey, Steve will review it, and we'll have it as an item on policies and procedures on the 8th.
And it's the 7th, I think, actually. It's not the 8th, right?
I thought it was the 8th.
The 7th is a Thursday, according to my calendar.
For policies and procedures?
Yeah, and the 8th is a Friday.
I could be wrong on the date. Always that possibility. It's early September.
Yes, Thursday, September 7th at 1:30. We're also going to have this discussion
Yes.
on Monday, September 11th, at our management team meeting. We'll have the draft document. Actually, so this we could read, if we can revise it, go to the policy procedures, have the revised document. Our management team, so directors, elected officials, and staff can review it as well and give some input.
And we'll bring it back sometime before the end of the year to the board. Okay. Okay, excellent. Then with that agenda item is done. And thanks, Diana. Thank you for all the work you put into it.
One more bit of clarification. Do you want another work session on it when it comes back, or do you just want it to come back as an order to discuss?
I think it's in order to discuss.
Discuss the possible action.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Diana. Thanks for all the work you put into that and being responsive. So we have then a review of assignments.
So I just have the one from Commissioner Bozevich for Alex Kyler to research 3 items. Request by GoRail for support letter regarding legislation for rail crossings. 2, to review local government tax issues, including municipal bonds and other legislative tax issues being looked at the federal level. And then the BLM request for input on the South Siuslaw watershed and a sensitive oak grove.
Any other assignments? Okay, I see none. Then we'll move along to other business. Any other business before the board this afternoon? Then we are adjourned. Have a good Labor Day weekend, everyone.